It was a bitterly cold evening in the village of Little Densworth, and the golden lamps of the Candlelit Inn glowed like beacons through the drifting fog. The inn stood at the crossroads, where the moor's winds swept down to meet the narrow cobbled lane that led toward the churchyard. Inside, there was laughter, the sound of mugs clinking, and the rich scent of stew and cider. It was the sort of night when villagers sought warmth and company, sharing gossip under the low timbered ceiling where smoke coiled lazily toward the beams. Miss Marple, visiting her distant cousin, Edith Weatherby, had been persuaded to stop by the inn for a bit of supper. She sat quietly near the hearth, knitting in her lap, and her sharp blue eyes moved between faces, smiling, nodding, listening as though she absorbed the hum of conversation itself. To anyone else, she looked a harmless old lady, yet every glance, every gesture, every tone of voice was carefully noted and tucked away like threads for later weaving. The innkeeper, Mr. Harold Cribb, was bustling behind the counter, wiping his hands on his apron as he filled glasses. "That'll be the last delivery from Kingsbridge this week," he was saying. "The roads are near flooded, and no one wants to risk that bridge again." His words brought a murmur of agreement. Little Densworth folk loved nothing more than to dwell on danger that might, with luck, stay just beyond their doorstep. At one of the tables, 3 guests sat apart from the villagers: a tall, elegant woman in a dark traveling coat, a nervous man with ink-stained fingers who kept glancing at his pocket watch, and an older gentleman with a walking stick whose sharp eyes missed little. They had arrived earlier that evening, their car splashed with mud, claiming to be on their way to Bath. Yet something about them made the villagers whisper: the woman's fine clothes, the man's evasive manner, and the elder's oddly possessive tone when he addressed her. As the clock struck 8, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows. The lights flickered, and for a moment the room fell into an uneasy hush. Then came a crash, a door slamming open somewhere near the stairwell. Mr. Cribb hurried off to see, muttering about the latch. The fire sputtered, sending shadows leaping across the faces of those gathered. Moments later, there was a cry, a woman's voice, high, startled, almost strangled. Chairs scraped, feet pounded. By the time Miss Marple reached the passage leading toward the guest rooms, a small crowd had already formed. There, at the foot of the narrow staircase, lay the tall gentleman with the walking stick, his eyes open and unseeing, his body twisted unnaturally upon the floorboards. A small candle lay beside him, still burning, its flame wavering in the draught like a trembling witness. "Fetch the doctor!" someone shouted. But Miss Marple was already kneeling beside the fallen man, her knitting bag forgotten at her feet. Her calm, wrinkled hand hovered near his collar, and she noted at once the faint scent of something sweet, something that didn't belong in an old country inn. When she looked up, she met the eyes of the elegant woman in the dark traveling coat. They were pale, wide, and full of something more than grief. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. "Poor man," Miss Marple said softly, almost to herself. "But how very curious that the candle should have gone out, then burned again." The woman trembled. The others murmured, exchanging frightened glances as the sound of the church bell drifted faintly through the fog outside. And though the village would later claim the death was an accident, a simple fall in the dark, Miss Marple's heart, guided by that unerring intuition of hers, had already begun to disagree. Somewhere in this quiet inn, beneath the smell of cider and damp wood, something unholy had taken place, and the murderer was still among them. The doctor arrived 20 minutes later, his carriage wheels hissing on the damp cobblestones. By then, the body had been moved to one of the small sitting rooms near the back of the inn, and the guests were gathered in uneasy silence. The elegant woman sat with her gloved hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on nothing. The nervous man paced the floor, muttering under his breath, while Mr. Cribb wrung his hands behind the counter, his normally ruddy face pale and damp. Miss Marple, who had taken it upon herself to prepare a small pot of tea, observed the scene from her quiet corner, her needles clicking softly as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Dr. Pembury, a stout man with a fur collar and perpetually red nose, examined the body with the weary precision of someone long accustomed to death. "Neck broken, most likely," he murmured, adjusting his spectacles. "Could have been the fall, but—" He leaned closer, sniffed the air, then frowned slightly. "There's something odd here." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "You noticed it too, Doctor?" she asked mildly. Her voice was low, polite, but it carried across the room like a bell in still air. That peculiar sweetness. I thought it might be almonds or something akin. Dr. Pembury's brows drew together. "You've a good nose, Miss Marple." "Yes, bitter almonds. That would suggest cyanide, though it's far too soon to be certain. I'll have to report this, of course. It's not my habit to speculate." "No, indeed," Miss Marple agreed, eyes glinting faintly in the lamplight. "Speculation can lead one astray, and yet I always find it interesting when a man who appears perfectly healthy dies in so public a manner." The local constable, a nervous young fellow named Briggs, arrived shortly after the doctor. He was well-meaning, though clearly overwhelmed by the presence of strangers and death in equal measure. "We'll be needing statements from everyone," he announced, his voice uncertain. "No one to leave the premises until Inspector Wells comes from Kingsbridge." This declaration caused immediate protest. The elegant woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Lydia Harcourt, rose to her feet. "Surely that's unnecessary," she said sharply. "This was a dreadful accident, nothing more. We were preparing to retire for the night. My husband slipped, that's all." Her tone cracked on the last word, and all eyes turned to her. "Your husband, madam?" asked Miss Marple softly. Mrs. Harcourt hesitated. "Yes, Colonel Arthur Harcourt, retired officer. We were traveling to Bath for his health." The ink-stained man stopped pacing. "You said husband, Lydia," he said coldly. "Funny you didn't mention that when you checked in. You called him your uncle." Her face blanched, and a hush fell over the room. Miss Marple's hands paused mid-knit. "Oh dear," she said, her voice almost sympathetic. "Such little inconsistencies do cause trouble later, don't they?" Constable Briggs cleared his throat and began scribbling in his notebook, his ears pink. The woman sank back into her chair, trembling while the doctor packed away his instruments. The rain had started again outside, pattering against the windows. The villagers who'd lingered were now whispering in corners, their voices low and anxious. Every few moments someone glanced at the door, as though expecting the murderer, if there was one, to burst through at any instant. Miss Marple quietly fetched another pot of tea, offering it first to Mrs. Harcourt, who refused it, then to the others. Her movements were unhurried, her expression mild. Yet behind those clear blue eyes, thought moved swiftly, neatly arranging facts in invisible order. The candle, the fall, the scent of almonds, and now the question of who this man truly was. When Inspector Wells finally arrived, tall, lean, with a face like weathered stone, he wasted no time in assuming control. "Dr. Pembury, your preliminary?" "Neck fracture, yes, but likely post-mortem." "Poison suspected." Wells grunted, turning his attention to the room. "None of you leaves until I've taken your statements. That means you too, Miss Marple," she supplied pleasantly, "of St. Mary Mead. I'm merely visiting my cousin." He nodded absently, already scribbling notes. "Right. Mr. Cribb, start from the beginning." The innkeeper stammered his way through the evening's events, describing how the guests had arrived, how they'd kept mostly to themselves, how the gentleman had seemed in fine health until he went upstairs. Nothing remarkable, except, Miss Marple noted, for the part where he mentioned that the colonel had asked for a particular room. Room 5. The one with the small window overlooking the back garden. "Curious choice," Miss Marple murmured when Wells paused. "It's the coldest room in the house. The inspector gave her a brief look, not unkind, but wary of interference. Perhaps he liked the view. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, though her tone suggested she doubted it. When the questioning ended and the others had been led away to rest, or rather, to sit awake in fearful silence, Miss Marple lingered by the hearth. The candle she'd seen earlier had been placed on a side table, its wax hardened in a strange, uneven pattern, as though someone had snuffed it out and relit it in haste. She studied it thoughtfully, noting the faintest smear of something dark at the base of its holder. Soot, perhaps, or residue from a powder. As she bent closer, she felt that familiar stirring, a quiet certainty that the truth lay not in the loud claims of witnesses, but in these small, overlooked details. The inn was full of whispers and half-truths tonight, but lies, she knew, had a peculiar way of showing themselves to those patient enough to wait. In the silence that followed, only the rain and the ticking of the clock filled the room. And Miss Marple, her knitting now forgotten on the armchair, sat perfectly still, gazing at the faint curl of smoke rising from the candle's spent wick. Somewhere within that thin wisp, the truth had already begun to take shape. The night deepened around the Candlelit Inn, and though the lamps still glowed in the sitting room, the air had grown colder, heavier, thick with that peculiar silence that follows death. The rain continued to fall, steady and insistent, whispering against the window panes like a voice that could not be silenced. Miss Marple remained near the hearth, her mind quietly sifting through the fragments of the evening. The broken neck, the scent of almonds, the frightened eyes of Mrs. Harcourt, and that small inconsistency about the relationship between the woman and the dead man. Lies, she knew, were never spoken once. They multiplied, clung to one another, and soon formed patterns. All one had to do was wait long enough for the pattern to emerge. Inspector Wells had retired temporarily to the adjoining office, with the constable and Dr. Pembury to telephone Kingsbridge for assistance. The line crackled faintly in the damp air, and his low voice carried only bits of his conversation, words like toxicology, motive, and contained them till morning. Miss Marple, sipping her lukewarm tea, listened without appearing to do so. The nervous man with the ink-stained fingers, who had identified himself as Mr. Raymond Pike, a writer by trade, had returned to pacing. His agitation was palpable. His fingers twitched as though yearning for a cigarette he dared not light. "Terrible business," he muttered suddenly, more to himself than anyone. "I told him not to come here, but he wouldn't listen. Said he had something to settle first, something old." Miss Marple looked up mildly. "Something old, Mr. Pike?" she asked, her tone one of innocent curiosity. He blinked, startled that she had spoken. "Yes, well, business, you might say. A matter of inheritance, I believe. Though why he would come to this miserable village for it, I can't begin to imagine." "Oh, but villages are never miserable to those who know where to look," Miss Marple said gently. "Sometimes what seems small or dull to others hides the most fascinating histories." He gave a strained laugh, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Fascinating, perhaps, but not for him now, eh?" Miss Marple's smile was faint, unreadable. "No, not for him." Before he could say more, the door opened and Inspector Wells stepped back into the room, his coat collar damp, his expression set. "No sign of forced entry," he announced. "No strangers seen about, and the guest's car is still where they left it. We'll need to send for the coroner at dawn, but for now, the inn remains sealed. No one leaves, no one enters." He looked at Miss Marple then, perhaps suspecting she knew more than her gentle face suggested. "You're visiting family nearby, I hear." "Yes," she replied. "My cousin Edith Weatherby. She lives just beyond the green. We had a nice supper planned for tomorrow." "Well, I hope it won't be delayed on account of this unpleasantness," said Wells, his tone polite but clipped. Then, turning to the others, You'll each remain in your rooms tonight. Constable Briggs will stand watch. I'll have questions for you in the morning." The group dispersed slowly, their footsteps creaking across the old wooden floorboards. Mrs. Harcourt lingered for a moment at the doorway, her face pale, lips pressed tight. When her eyes met Miss Marple's, there was a flicker. Fear again, but mixed with something like pleading. Then she turned away and ascended the stairs without a word. Miss Marple rose and gathered her knitting. "If I may, Inspector," she said softly, "might I sit a while longer by the fire? I'm afraid I find it difficult to sleep after disturbances." Wells hesitated, then nodded. "Very well, but don't wander about. We can't have the scene disturbed." "Of course," she said, lowering herself back into her chair as he left. When she was sure she was alone, Miss Marple's eyes drifted once more to the candle on the side table. Its wick was bent slightly, as though it had been pressed down before being relit. She reached forward, her fingers steady, and touched the edge of the holder. It was cool now, but when she tilted it slightly, a thin crust of wax flaked away, revealing the faint trace of a powdery substance beneath, almost invisible in the dim light. She brushed a bit of it between her fingers and brought it near her nose. The scent was faint but unmistakable. Bitter almonds again. "Clever," she whispered. "Very clever indeed." The sound of the wind outside masked her voice, and she sat back, considering. The poison, if that was what it had been, must have been administered before the fall. A drink, perhaps, or even the candle itself, if one were inclined to be imaginative. She had once heard of a case in Devon where a man had been poisoned by vapors from a candle wick treated with cyanide, a trick most unusual, but not impossible for someone with knowledge of such things. Her gaze shifted toward the stairs. Mrs. Harcourt's room was directly above the sitting room, and the faint sound of footsteps pacing back and forth came from above. Nervous, restless steps. Meanwhile, somewhere down the hall, a door creaked open. The writer's room, most likely. Miss Marple waited, and a few moments later, she heard the faint scrape of glass against wood, then the unmistakable sound of a latch being tested. She smiled faintly. So neither of them intends to sleep. The minutes stretched on, the fire burning lower until only the embers glowed. At last, when the inn had settled into uneasy quiet, Miss Marple rose and tiptoed toward the counter where Mr. Cribb had earlier placed the visitor's register. The book lay open, the ink still glistening faintly beside the last entry. There it was in bold, neat writing, Colonel Arthur Harcourt and wife. But just above it, an older entry caught her eye, 2 weeks prior, written in a different hand. Arthur Harcourt, single room, 2 nights. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. "So he's been here before," she murmured. "And this visit was no accident." She closed the book carefully, leaving it exactly as she found it. The pattern was beginning to take shape now. Old grievances, false identities, and a death far too deliberate to be chance. When she finally returned to her chair, dawn was still some hours away. The inn creaked softly around her, the air thick with smoke and secrets. Miss Marple folded her hands, her knitting untouched beside her, and listened once more to the faint pacing above. The woman upstairs was waiting for something, or fearing it. Either way, Miss Marple intended to find out which by morning. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 3, its deep chime rolling through the corridors like a warning. The Candlelit Inn had sunk into uneasy silence, though every board and beam seemed to groan under the weight of secrets. Miss Marple sat motionless by the dying fire, the soft glow painting her features with flickers of gold and shadow. Above her, the pacing had ceased. Mrs. Harcourt's footsteps had stopped altogether. Perhaps she had finally succumbed to exhaustion or to fear. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the darkened staircase, where faint candlelight spilled from the landing. Constable Briggs, drowsy and pale, had stationed himself there with all the earnestness of youth, though his eyelids fluttered dangerously. "You'll find," Miss Marple had said earlier, "that vigilance is best maintained with a pot of strong tea." He had smiled, then promptly forgotten the advice. Now his chin rested against his chest, the rhythmic creak of the chair betraying his shallow sleep. It was in that stillness that she heard it, the almost imperceptible click of a latch upstairs, followed by the soft brush of fabric against wood. Someone was moving again. Miss Marple rose without a sound. Her steps were measured, careful, her mind sharply alert beneath the guise of gentleness. The faint glow on the landing grew brighter as she neared the top, and there, just beyond the corner, she saw a narrow band of light beneath a door, room 5, where the dead man had lain hours earlier. She paused, listening. A whisper drifted through the door, too low to make out, but urgent. Then came the scrape of a drawer, the sound of paper rustling. Miss Marple waited a moment longer before speaking, her voice calm, almost apologetic. "You really shouldn't be in there, my dear," she said quietly. A gasp answered her. The door flew open, revealing Mrs. Harcourt standing in the threshold, candle trembling in her hand. Her face was pale as ivory, her hair loosened from its neat chignon, and in her other hand she clutched a stack of letters bound with red ribbon. "Miss Marple? I wasn't—" "Of course you weren't," Miss Marple said kindly, stepping closer. "You were only looking for something that might disappear by morning, I imagine." Mrs. Harcourt's lips parted, but no sound came. The candlelight quivered, throwing their shadows large and distorted across the walls. "May I come in?" Miss Marple asked gently, not waiting for permission before crossing the threshold. The air in the room was thick with the lingering scent of cologne and something faintly acrid, the same almond trace she had noticed before. The bedclothes were disturbed, the case where the deceased's belongings had been kept now open and half emptied. Miss Marple's eyes fell on the small nightstand, where a pocket watch lay beside a glass of water. She moved closer and lifted the watch. It had stopped precisely at 7:52, the exact moment, as she recalled, when the storm had reached its height and the lights had flickered downstairs. "He told me to burn them," Mrs. Harcourt whispered suddenly, clutching the bundle of letters tighter. "He begged me to destroy them before anyone found out. But I couldn't. You see. They prove everything." Miss Marple looked at her with quiet patience. "Prove what, my dear?" Mrs. Harcourt hesitated, then sank into the chair beside the window. "That he wasn't who he said he was. Arthur Harcourt, yes, that was his name once. But he'd been living under false pretenses for years. He'd changed after the war. There was money missing, investments gone wrong, a trust broken. Those letters," she looked down at them with trembling fingers, "were from the people he deceived. They wanted repayment, and they found him here." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her thoughts quickened. "Then you weren't his wife at all?" "No." The word escaped like a confession. "I was his secretary. He said marriage would make it easier to travel without suspicion. I didn't kill him, Miss Marple. I swear it. I came here to help him make peace with someone, a man named Pike. They served together, but there was something between them, something bitter. I don't know what happened that night, only that he went upstairs after arguing with Mr. Pike. When I heard the fall," she covered her face, and for a moment only the ticking of the stopped watch filled the silence. Miss Marple studied her quietly, the faintest frown touching her brow. "You say they argued? About what?" "I don't know exactly. Mr. Pike accused him of something, of taking the blame for a death that wasn't his. A young officer, I think. There was shouting, then Mr. Pike left the table. Arthur, Colonel Harcourt, looked quite shaken afterward. He drank half a glass of water, said he needed air, and went upstairs. That was the last I saw of him alive." Miss Marple nodded slowly, glancing once more at the water glass. "And the candle?" she asked. Mrs. Harcourt looked confused. The candle? Yes. Someone took it from this room. It was found burning beside his body, downstairs. I wonder who thought to bring light to a dead man in such a hurry. The woman's eyes widened. I don't know. I swear I don't. Miss Marple gave a small, sympathetic smile. No, I imagine you don't, but perhaps someone else does. From the doorway came a rustle and a sharp intake of breath. Mr. Pike stood there, his dressing gown hastily thrown over his shoulders, his eyes dark with fatigue or guilt. You've no right, he said harshly, stepping forward. No right to question her like this. She's been through enough. Miss Marple's gaze turned to him, unblinking. Forgive me, Mr. Pike, but in my experience, people who have been through enough rarely go prowling through locked rooms at 3 a.m. He froze, glancing at Mrs. Harcourt, then back at her. You think I killed him? I think, said Miss Marple quietly, that the truth has been hiding behind fear for far too long. And if I'm not mistaken, you're both very afraid, but not of the same thing. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. Mrs. Harcourt clutched the letters as though they were her last defense, while Mr. Pike's jaw clenched in silent rage. Miss Marple looked from one to the other, her expression calm but certain, as though she had just found the thread that would unravel everything. I should like to speak with Inspector Wells in the morning, she said softly, for I believe we shall find that Colonel Harcourt's death was not an accident at all, but rather the end of a promise made long ago and kept only tonight. Dawn crept over Little Densworth with a reluctant grayness, washing the Candlelit Inn in the dim light of a sleepless night. The rain had stopped, leaving the cobbles slick and glistening under the pale sky. Inside, the fire had long since died to ashes, and the smell of damp smoke lingered faintly in the air. Miss Marple sat once again in her chair by the hearth, knitting idle in her lap. She had not slept, though her calm expression suggested otherwise. Every detail of the night's strange events played quietly in her mind. The broken candle, the halted watch, the whispered confession, and the 2 frightened souls who had crossed paths in a web spun years before. Inspector Wells returned just after 7, coat collar turned up against the morning chill. He looked tired but sharp, his eyes moving immediately to Miss Marple as though he already expected she had been awake and thinking. Morning, Miss Marple, he said curtly. I've had word from Kingsbridge. The coroner's on his way. Dr. Pembury's confirmed traces of cyanide in the victim's glass. Miss Marple nodded softly. So the almond scent was no imagination then. Indeed not. The man was poisoned before the fall. He hesitated, then added, I'm told you were seen wandering about last night, speaking to Mrs. Harcourt and Mr. Pike. That so? I did, she replied without defensiveness. It's remarkable how people reveal themselves when they believe the night is too heavy for truth to matter. Wells gave her a narrow look. You think one of them did it? I think, she said thoughtfully, that both of them know far more than they've said. But one of them is lying by habit, while the other lies out of fear. The inspector sighed. You'd make a detective uncomfortable with that kind of talk. Oh, but only the ones who don't already suspect the same thing, Miss Marple said mildly. He gave a reluctant half-smile. You'd best come along then. We'll question them together. They found Mrs. Harcourt in the small breakfast room, her eyes red-rimmed, hands trembling around a cup of untouched tea. The letters she had clutched through the night were gone, though the faint imprint of the ribbon still marked her fingers. She looked up as they entered, her composure brittle. Mrs. Harcourt, said Wells, pulling up a chair. We know Colonel Harcourt was poisoned. You told Miss Marple that you were his secretary, not his wife, and that he had enemies. Tell me, did you know what he was doing here? Her lips quivered. He wanted to meet Mr. Pike. They had business left unfinished. I didn't know it would end like this, Inspector, I swear. He was frightened, but he wouldn't tell me why. Only that Pike had discovered something from years ago when they were both stationed abroad. Some financial matter? Wells asked. No, she whispered. "A death. A man under their command died in suspicious circumstances, and Arthur, Colonel Harcourt, was blamed. He left the service soon after. But Pike knew the truth, or said he did. He blackmailed him for years." Miss Marple's needles clicked once, softly, then stilled. "And so the good colonel came here to buy silence?" Mrs. Harcourt nodded faintly. "He brought money, yes. But it was no use. Pike said it wasn't about money anymore." "What then?" asked Miss Marple, leaning slightly forward. She looked at them both, eyes wide with fear. Revenge. Before they could press further, a commotion rose in the corridor. Constable Briggs appeared, breathless, his face pale. "Inspector, you'd better come. It's Pike, sir. He's gone." They hurried upstairs, Miss Marple following at a steady pace. The door to Mr. Pike's room stood open, the bed unmade, the window flung wide to the morning air. A single boot print marked the sill, leading outward to the roof of the lower veranda. On the writing desk lay a crumpled note, scrawled hastily in ink. Wells read it aloud. "I can't stay. The past's caught up with me. You'll find what you need in the letters. Tell her I'm sorry." "Fools run," muttered the inspector, rushing to the window. "He won't get far on foot." But Miss Marple didn't move. Her gaze had fixed on the small ink bottle beside the note, its rim crusted, its liquid faintly cloudy. "Inspector," she said quietly, "he won't get far at all." Wells turned sharply. "What do you mean?" She pointed delicately at the bottle. "Cyanide leaves its mark even when diluted, and if one has been dosing another man's glass, one might not think twice before sealing a confession with the same ink." Wells strode forward, sniffed and swore under his breath. "You mean he's poisoned himself?" Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "No, he's been poisoned, Inspector, but not by his own hand." Wells stared at her. "Then who?" She lifted her knitting once more, looping the yarn as if discussing something quite ordinary. "Mrs. Harcourt said she destroyed nothing. Yet this morning the letters have vanished. She lied because she believed the letters could condemn her, or perhaps because one of them already has. I should very much like to know what became of the red ribbon she used to bind them." Briggs returned moments later, his voice shaking. "We found him, sir, by the stables. He's dead." Wells straightened, grim-faced. "We'll search her room next." But Miss Marple only sighed softly, her needles clicking once more. "There's no need to hurry, Inspector. The truth isn't going anywhere. It's been sitting in this inn for a very long time, waiting for someone to notice it." He frowned. "You mean the poison?" She looked up, her expression mild, but her eyes sharp as glass. "No, Inspector. I mean the promise that was broken all those years ago, the one that turned 2 frightened people into liars, and one of them into a killer. We've been looking for a murderer, but what we've found instead is a debt that demanded payment in death." Outside, the bells of Little Densworth Church began to ring, their sound cold and distant in the morning mist, and as the echoes faded, Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly, as though some invisible thread in her mind had just been tied off, quietly, perfectly, and without a single loose end. The rain returned by mid-morning, a fine mist that settled over the inn like a shroud. The cobbles outside gleamed under the weak light, and the air inside smelled faintly of wet wool and extinguished candles. Inspector Wells stood at the window of the sitting room, arms folded, while Constable Briggs scurried back and forth collecting statements. The dead writer, Mr. Pike, had been carried to the coach-house and covered respectfully, though the sight of him, his lips faintly blue, his fingers still ink-stained, lingered in everyone's minds. Miss Marple, seated quietly in her accustomed chair near the hearth, appeared absorbed in her knitting, but her eyes had a faraway brightness to them. She was thinking of promises, of debts, and of the way people could twist the truth to protect something already rotten. Her needles clicked rhythmically, keeping time with the slow drip of rain from the eaves outside. Inspector Wells turned at last, his voice low but edged with fatigue. 2 deaths in one night, Miss Marple, and both of them poisoned. Do you believe in coincidences? Not of that sort, Inspector, she replied calmly. I have always found coincidence to be the refuge of lazy reasoning. He gave a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. Then you'll agree this isn't chance. But I can't yet see who stood to gain. Pike blackmailed Harcourt. Harcourt was a ruined man, and Mrs. Harcourt, or Miss whatever her name is, seems only frightened. Still, frightened people do strange things. Yes, Miss Marple murmured, winding her yarn, especially when their fear has been cultivated over years. Wells frowned. You think she's been protecting someone? Miss Marple looked up, her tone still mild, but her eyes shrewd. Not protecting, Inspector, repaying. There's a difference. Before he could reply, Briggs entered carrying a small parcel wrapped in paper. We found this in the lady's trunk, sir, he said. Hidden under her clothes. Thought you'd want to see. Wells unwrapped it carefully. Inside lay a small glass vial, half filled with a cloudy residue, and beside it the faint crimson thread of a ribbon. He exhaled slowly. Cyanide residue, he said. And this is what bound the letters Pike mentioned. She lied, Miss Marple. She never destroyed them. Miss Marple's fingers stilled. No, she said softly. I don't suppose she could. Sentiment is a curious thing. Even guilt has its keepsakes. They found Mrs. Harcourt moments later in her room, seated by the window as if waiting to be summoned. Her eyes were hollow, her face pale but composed. When Wells placed the parcel on the table before her, she didn't flinch. So it's done then, she whispered. He's dead too. Yes, said Wells. And unless you'd care to explain, you may as well tell me which of them you killed first. She closed her eyes. You don't understand. Then help me, he said roughly. Because from where I stand, it looks like revenge. He ruined your name, perhaps. Used you? Her eyes opened, and for the first time, there was fire in them. He ruined everything, she said, her voice trembling but strong. Arthur Harcourt was not a good man. He took money that wasn't his. He let another man die in his place, and when Mr. Pike threatened to expose him, he laughed. He said no one would believe a writer of sensational tales. I thought perhaps he'd beg forgiveness. Instead, he mocked him, even while handing him the poisoned glass. And when Pike realized what had happened, when he saw the truth, he did the only thing left to him. Wells leaned forward. You're saying Pike didn't kill Harcourt? You're saying Harcourt killed Pike? She shook her head slowly. No, Inspector. I'm saying Pike killed himself because Harcourt already had. The room went still. Rain tapped faintly at the glass. Wells blinked, confusion flickering across his face. That makes no sense. It makes perfect sense, said Miss Marple quietly. She rose, her knitting abandoned on the chair. Don't you see, Inspector? Mr. Pike had been living with guilt, years of it. He knew the man he'd served under had taken the blame for a death that was truly his doing. Blackmail wasn't vengeance, it was remorse turned outward. He came here not to destroy Harcourt, but to confess. And Harcourt, knowing his own ruin was inevitable, chose to end it on his own terms, with poison, neat and controlled. The broken neck was merely a postscript. Wells stared at her. You're saying he took his own life? I'm saying, she replied softly, that a proud man's suicide often wears the costume of accident. But Mr. Pike couldn't bear the weight once it was done. He stayed alive only long enough to write his apology, and perhaps to drink from the same ink that had recorded his guilt. Mrs. Harcourt had begun to weep silently, her tears falling one by one onto her clasped hands. He made me promise, she said faintly. He said the letters must be burned, that no one should ever know. I couldn't do it. I kept them because I wanted someone to understand what it cost." Miss Marple walked to the window, her small frame outlined against the pale light. "I believe we understand now," she said. Both men were prisoners of their own sins, each trying to absolve the other in their own dreadful way. Wells rubbed a hand over his face, his voice low. "You make it sound almost tragic." "It is tragic, Inspector," Miss Marple replied. "Not all murders are born of malice. Some begin as mercy and end in despair. The poison only hastened what remorse had already begun." Silence filled the room once more, heavy but not cruel. The truth at last had settled like dust on the old inn, inevitable and still. When the coroner's men arrived an hour later, the rain had stopped. Mrs. Harcourt was led away quietly, her hands bound not by guilt, but by exhaustion. Inspector Wells stood on the threshold watching her depart, while Miss Marple lingered in the doorway, her eyes lifted to the faint glimmer of sunlight breaking through the mist. "Another sad story in a small village," she murmured, "and like most such stories, Inspector, it ended long before we ever arrived." Wells glanced at her, half a smile ghosting across his face. "I'll be sure to mention that in my report, Miss Marple." But she was already turning away, her shawl gathered neatly around her shoulders. "Oh, do," she said softly, "though I rather think no one will believe it. They rarely do." And with that, she stepped out into the pale morning, the inn behind her, sinking once more into quiet, its secrets spent, its candles extinguished, and its truth folded away like a letter that would never be read again. The quiet that followed seemed almost unnatural, as though the inn itself were holding its breath. The villagers who had gathered in small knots outside now drifted away, murmuring half-formed speculations about tragedy, romance, and poison. Inside, Inspector Wells lingered by the parlor window, staring out toward the grey lane where Mrs. Harcourt's carriage had disappeared. His reflection in the glass looked older somehow, blurred by the morning's damp light. Behind him, Miss Marple remained seated at the small table near the fire, her knitting now resting idle beside a cup of cooling tea. She had not spoken since the inspector's last remark, but her mind had not stopped moving for an instant. At length, Wells turned. "I've sent word to Kingsbridge to close the file as suicide and accidental poisoning," he said. "2 lives, 2 endings. It's tidy enough as these things go." Miss Marple's eyes flicked up at that word, so tidy. "Tidy endings, Inspector," she said softly, "are rarely true ones. They are simply endings that make the living comfortable." He frowned, folding his arms. "You think we've missed something?" "I think," she replied, "that the truth is seldom satisfied with being tidy. It tends to leave behind small, untidy things, a misplaced gesture, a word said too soon, a question that no one thought to ask." Wells sighed. "You've something particular in mind, I suppose." Miss Marple rose, her expression thoughtful, almost pained. "I keep returning to that glass of water," she said. "The one on Colonel Harcourt's table. It was half full when found, wasn't it?" Pembury said so, yes. "And yet, Mr. Pike drank from it," she continued quietly. "He must have. There was no other source of poison found in his room. But if Harcourt had taken his own life, the residue would have settled. The water would not have been clear enough to tempt another. Cyanide has a distinct scent. One does not drink it by mistake." Wells straightened, his voice sharpening. "You're suggesting it wasn't suicide after all?" Miss Marple met his eyes steadily. "I'm suggesting that Harcourt might not have been dead when we thought he was." The inspector stared at her, struggling to follow. "Not dead. You examined him yourself. He had no pulse." "Indeed. But poison can mimic death when the dose is small. It slows the heart, weakens the breath. If one were clever enough to give just enough to feign death, a man might appear gone for several minutes before recovery. Long enough, perhaps, to make others believe he'd fallen victim. And when someone, perhaps his partner in guilt, leaned over him in horror, Wells's eyes widened. He could strike again. Miss Marple nodded faintly. Or ensure silence forever. The inspector moved to the table, rubbing his temples. But why? If Harcourt poisoned Pike, why take the full dose himself later? She looked toward the rain-darkened window. Because perhaps he didn't mean to. Perhaps in the confusion when he tried to stage Pike's death as self-inflicted, he misjudged the measure. Men like Colonel Harcourt always believe they can control every outcome. Pride is often deadlier than poison. A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Mr. Cribb, the innkeeper, pale and nervous as ever. "Beg pardon, Inspector," he said. "I've just found something in the ash bin out back. Thought you'd want to see." He handed over a small metal case, its edges blackened by fire. Inside, when Wells prized it open, were the charred remains of paper, still legible enough to show fragments of handwriting. Miss Marple leaned closer, reading the words that survived. He said it was for her protection, cannot allow both of us. The rest had been eaten by flame. Wells exhaled slowly. So he meant to destroy them all. Not all, Miss Marple said. Not if Mrs. Harcourt still had her own bundle. This must have been his copy, the one that would have damned him completely. But notice the phrasing, Inspector, for her protection. He was shielding her. She was no accomplice. He planned everything to preserve her innocence, even if it meant dying twice. Once by deceit, once by error. The inspector's voice softened. "You think she never knew what he intended?" "She believed she'd been helping him cover guilt," Miss Marple replied. "In truth, she was helping him atone for it. Love, Inspector, is a peculiar thing. It can drive a man to deception and yet make that deception feel like grace." They stood in silence for a moment, the steady hiss of the rain filling the space between them. Then Wells looked at her with a weary smile. "You've a strange way of making tragedy sound almost merciful." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Mercy and justice are seldom far apart, Inspector. One simply arrives a little late." He nodded, pocketing the burnt case. "I'll file the report differently then. Double death. Mutual deception, perhaps. You'll forgive me if I don't use your poetry in the paperwork." "I should be disappointed if you did," she said gently. Outside, the village began to stir again, the baker's cart rattling past, a dog barking near the square. Life resumed its steady rhythm, indifferent to the dark truths that had briefly passed through its quiet heart. Miss Marple gathered her shawl around her shoulders and moved toward the door. "I shall walk to my cousin's now," she said. "It's a dreadful thing to face after a sleepless night, but I find a brisk morning and a bit of company always set things right again." Wells opened the door for her, the mist curling around them. "You'll stay in Little Densworth a while longer, I hope. We might need your insight again." She smiled up at him. "Oh, I expect I shall, Inspector. It's a dear little village and quite incapable, I fear, of staying peaceful for long." As she stepped out into the soft drizzle, her figure grew smaller along the lane until only the faint outline of her hat remained through the fog. Inside, Wells watched her go, the weight of the case still pressing on his mind. He looked once more at the burned papers, then at the cold fireplace, and thought of how close the truth had come to perishing with them. But Miss Marple, somewhere up the lane, was already thinking of other things, of human frailty, of secrets disguised as love, and of how evil so rarely announces itself with malice. More often, it arrived with quiet steps, in rooms lit by gentle firelight, where death came not in rage, but in resignation. And as the bells of St. Luke's began to toll again through the mist, Miss Marple whispered to herself, "Poor souls, they thought the past could be buried, but the past, like poison, always finds its way to the surface." The mist thickened as the morning advanced, rolling through Little Densworth like a ghost reluctant to leave. Miss Marple walked along the narrow lane, her boots leaving faint prints on the damp stones, her thoughts turning over each fragment of the night's events. The Candlelit Inn, now dim and silent behind her, seemed to recede into memory rather than distance. Yet something tugged faintly at her mind, a small thread left unpulled, delicate but insistent. She slowed near the churchyard gate, glancing toward the rows of gravestones glistening with dew. The fog curled about them like soft smoke, and the bells from St. Luke's still echoed faintly through the air. She had seen too many cases to mistake silence for peace. Somewhere, behind the weary explanations and tidy conclusions, there was always something that didn't quite fit, and Miss Marple, with her lifelong habit of noticing what didn't fit, found herself pausing, her gaze drifting back down the lane toward the inn. Behind her, a carriage rattled by, the same one that had taken Mrs. Harcourt away to Kingsbridge under supervision. For a fleeting instant, Miss Marple thought she saw movement inside. A pale face turned toward the window, but the fog swallowed it before she could be sure. She stood still a moment longer, then turned around and began walking back. Inside the inn, Inspector Wells was giving final instructions to Constable Briggs, who looked both relieved and anxious to see her return. "You're back already, Miss Marple?" Wells asked, surprised. "Yes," she said pleasantly. "I suddenly realized something rather important about those letters." Wells's brows furrowed. "We've already examined what's left of them. Nothing useful remained." "Precisely," Miss Marple replied, lowering herself into her chair by the hearth once more. "And that, Inspector, is what troubles me. Letters that survive even partial burning usually reveal some pattern of thought. Anger, fear, confession. But these, well, the fragments you found were oddly deliberate. They didn't feel like the remnants of something hastily destroyed. They felt like a performance, as if someone had wanted us to find exactly what we did." Wells frowned. "You're suggesting Harcourt, or someone else, staged it?" She nodded. "Consider the line for her protection. It reads almost like a line written for effect, the phrasing too theatrical, too self-conscious. Men on the brink of ruin seldom compose tidy sentences. They scrawl, they beg, they contradict themselves. But this was written by someone who wanted to direct our understanding." The inspector leaned forward, his voice low. "You think the letter was planted?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that our good colonel may not have written it at all. And that means one of two things. Either Mr. Pike forged it after Harcourt's death, or Mrs. Harcourt did so afterward to ensure her story aligned with the evidence." Wells ran a hand over his jaw, pacing to the window. "If you're right, it changes everything. But the handwriting could be imitated easily," Miss Marple said, "especially by someone who had spent years typing his correspondence and taking dictation for him. Secretaries develop an uncanny eye for their employer's hand." The inspector turned sharply. "You mean Mrs. Harcourt forged the letter herself?" Miss Marple's tone softened. "Not out of malice, I think. Out of fear. You see, I've been thinking about her behavior, the tremor in her voice, the way she clutched those letters as if they were both her salvation and her noose. Fear can drive a person to dreadful cleverness." Before Wells could respond, the door opened and Mr. Cribb stepped in, hat clutched in his hands. "Beg pardon, sir," he said nervously. "A telegram's just come from Kingsbridge. It's from the constable escorting Mrs. Harcourt. He says she collapsed not 5 minutes after they arrived. Doctors attending her now. And there's something else. They found another letter in her handbag." Wells took the paper, scanning it quickly. His expression hardened. "It's addressed to you, Miss Marple." He handed it over and she unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was uneven, hurried, this time not the neat, performative script from before. The letter read, "I could not let it stand. He killed more than one man, and I helped him. I thought ending it would bring peace, but the truth will not rest. You saw it, didn't you? You always do. Please forgive me for not staying to explain. The inn was never meant for love. It was built for debts. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on that last sentence. The inn was built for debts, she murmured. That's an odd choice of words, don't you think? Wells exhaled heavily. Sounds like the rambling of a guilty conscience to me. Perhaps, she said softly. But I wonder whose conscience she truly carried. Her own or his? The inspector watched her as she folded the letter again, her face unreadable in the dim light. You think she meant to join them? He asked quietly. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the grey square beyond, where the fog still clung to the hedges and the first glimmers of sunlight fought through. No, Inspector, she said at last. I think she meant to finish what they both began. She wasn't merely a frightened woman. She was the last custodian of their shared lie. And when it began to unravel, she did what many women in her position do. She chose silence over shame. Wells closed his notebook slowly. So that's the end of it, then? Miss Marple's eyes softened. Yes, I imagine it is. Though the end, like the truth, is rarely what we think it to be. People often die long before their hearts stop beating, Inspector. The rest is just formality. For a moment, neither spoke. The rain had eased, and faint sunlight spilled across the hearth, warming the edges of her shawl. Then, with a sigh, Wells straightened his coat and said, You're a strange comfort, Miss Marple. Grim, but oddly comforting. She smiled faintly, gathering her knitting once more. Life is grim, Inspector. Comfort simply helps it pass a little more gracefully. As she resumed her gentle work, the Candlelit Inn grew still again, the quiet kind of stillness that follows revelation rather than resolution. Outside, the mist began to lift, revealing the world as it had always been, calm, indifferent, and faintly deceptive, like a face smiling just enough to hide what it remembers. By late afternoon, the fog had lifted from Little Densworth, leaving behind the faint shimmer of damp on every hedge and window pane. The Candlelit Inn looked oddly smaller in daylight, less a place of secrets, more an aging relic of stone and ivy. Yet within its walls, the air remained thick with the residue of what had happened. Inspector Wells sat at the old oak table, finishing his report in neat, measured handwriting. Beside him, Miss Marple sat quietly with her cup of tea, her eyes fixed not on the paper, but on the fading embers in the hearth. The inn was nearly empty now. Mr. Cribb had taken himself to the back kitchen, moving with the heavy silence of a man who had seen too much in one night. Outside, the horses stamped restlessly in their stables, and a cart creaked down the lane carrying away the last official from Kingsbridge. It should have been an ending, neat, complete, tragic perhaps, but finished. Yet Miss Marple's expression said otherwise. You're thinking of something, Wells said at last, setting his pen down. I can tell by that look, the one that comes just before you ask a question that makes me wish I'd left an hour earlier. She smiled faintly. How perceptive of you, Inspector. Yes, I am thinking. About the line in Mrs. Harcourt's letter, the inn being built for debts. He sighed, leaning back. You've mentioned that twice now. You think it meant more than poetic remorse? I think it meant precisely what it said, Miss Marple replied softly. You see, people often confess with more truth than they realize. Words slip past their guard and reveal the shape of what lies beneath. Built for debts. That isn't metaphor, Inspector. It's history. Wells frowned. You mean the building itself? Yes. Mr. Cribb told me last night that his family took over the inn only 30 years ago. But before that, the property was owned by the Harcourt family. By Arthur Harcourt's father, in fact. It wasn't always an inn. It was once a coaching house tied to the Harcourt estate. A convenient place for travellers to rest and for certain kinds of dealings to pass unnoticed. The inspector's eyes narrowed. Financial dealings? Miss Marple nodded. Precisely. The elder Harcourt was known, quietly, for lending money to desperate men after the war. He called it helping the village recover. But in truth it was usury dressed as charity. Many men lost their farms, their homes. Those who couldn't repay were forced into servitude of one sort or another. Arthur Harcourt inherited that legacy. Inspector. Not just in property, but in guilt. Wells rubbed his chin, thinking. So when Pike spoke of debts and betrayal, he might have meant literal debts. Among other kinds, Miss Marple said. Colonel Harcourt and Mr. Pike served together abroad, yes, but their connection went deeper. I suspect that Pike's family was once indebted to the Harcourts, and that the so-called blackmail was something else entirely, a demand for restitution. Perhaps Pike believed the Harcourts had ruined his father. Perhaps Arthur's wealth, even his commission, came from that ill-gotten inheritance. The inspector rose, pacing. It would explain his obsession with secrecy. The false marriage, the letters, the strange choice to stay at the very inn his family once owned. He turned sharply. But that still doesn't tell us who started this mess, or why two people ended up dead. Miss Marple watched him kindly, her hands folded over her knitting. Because, Inspector, the mess started long before either of them arrived here. The sins of one generation have a peculiar way of repeating themselves, always in smaller, meaner shapes. The first Harcourt built an inn on debt. His son built a life on deceit, and poor Mrs. Harcourt, or Miss Harcourt as we now know, built her love upon both. Wells stopped pacing. You're saying she knew from the beginning? I believe she discovered it gradually, Miss Marple said. Imagine being young, impressionable, attached to a man who presents himself as broken but noble. You type his letters, manage his accounts, perhaps even hide the evidence of his failures, all in the name of loyalty. Until one day, loyalty begins to feel like complicity. By then, of course, it's too late. Affection and guilt are terrible twins, Inspector. They make accomplices of the most innocent people. He stared at her, half in admiration, half in disbelief. You make it sound inevitable. Oh, human nature usually is, she said softly. Mrs. Harcourt didn't mean to kill anyone, but when Harcourt's plan unraveled, when he feigned death and Pike realized the deception, she must have panicked. Perhaps she saw Pike with the glass, thought him mad with grief, or thought he meant to drink what Harcourt left behind. A moment's impulse, a misguided act of protection, and suddenly 2 lives were ended instead of 1. Wells's face tightened. You think she gave Pike the poison herself? I think she believed she was sparing him, Miss Marple said quietly. He'd seen too much, carried too much guilt. To her it must have seemed like mercy. Only later, when she saw what she'd done, when she realized that she'd preserved not mercy but shame, did she decide to follow them both. The inspector sank into the chair opposite her, rubbing his forehead. You're describing tragedy, Miss Marple, not crime. Most murders are both, she replied. For a long moment, there was only the faint ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Then Wells looked up again, weary but oddly peaceful. So that's your final word on it? Yes, she said gently, and I suspect the official record will say as much. Death by poison, with intent uncertain. That will satisfy the law, if not the heart. He nodded slowly. And you? Does it satisfy you? Miss Marple gave a small, rueful smile. Oh, I'm far too old to expect satisfaction, Inspector. Understanding is quite enough. Outside, the clouds began to part, a thin ribbon of sunlight spilling across the table between them. Wells closed his notebook and stood. Well, Miss Marple, he said, if ever I find myself lost in another village full of tragedy and deceit, I hope you'll be sitting just where you are now, ready to ruin all my tidy conclusions. She laughed softly. Oh, I do hope not, Inspector. but I imagine it's rather likely." When he left, the door closed with a faint echo, leaving her alone in the quiet inn. She looked once more into the hearth, where the last coal glowed faintly red, and whispered almost to herself, "The Candlelit Inn. Yes, quite an apt name. Some lights burn not for warmth, but for remembrance." Then she gathered her shawl, placed her knitting neatly into her bag, and stepped out into the pale light of evening, her figure small and composed against the fading sky, as the inn behind her settled once more into silence, holding its final secret close, as all old houses do. Evening came slowly to Little Densworth, spreading a gentle hush across the village. The clouds had thinned, revealing streaks of pale rose in the sky, and a faint breeze carried the scent of wet earth and chimney smoke. Miss Marple walked the narrow lane toward her cousin's cottage, her pace unhurried, her thoughts quietly turning. Most people, she reflected, believe that murder left behind noise, a lasting echo of outrage and fear. But in her experience, true evil ended not with noise, but with silence, the kind that seeps into corners and lingers long after justice has packed up and gone home. By the time she reached Edith Weatherby's gate, the lamps had been lit in the windows, their glow spilling softly through lace curtains. Edith, a plump and cheerful woman with a fondness for gossip and sponge cake, greeted her with open arms and a worried expression. "Jane, my dear, I was beginning to think you'd gone off with that inspector. You look exhausted. Was it dreadful?" Miss Marple removed her hat, shaking her head gently. "Not dreadful, Edith. Merely sad. A great deal of suffering, long before the deaths ever occurred." Edith tutted sympathetically, ushering her inside. "Well, you must tell me everything. The whole village has been talking of nothing else. Poison, deceit, and that poor woman taken away in tears. Terrible business. Terrible. I always said there was something peculiar about that inn. Did you know my late brother stayed there once and said he couldn't sleep a wink? Said he felt watched the whole night." Miss Marple smiled faintly, easing herself into a chair by the fire. "Perhaps he was, dear. Some buildings do seem to remember more than they ought." Edith shuddered and poured tea. "Well, I'm glad it's over. I can't bear to think of such wickedness so close to home." But Miss Marple only sipped her tea, her gaze distant. Over. It was a pleasant word, neat and final, like a drawer shut firmly after one has tidied its contents. Yet something about the events refused to stay neatly folded away. There was still a corner sticking out, a question, faint but persistent. "Edith," she said after a moment, "you wouldn't happen to know if Colonel Harcourt's family still owns any property near the old estate?" Her cousin frowned, thinking, "Oh yes, there's a cottage up by the mill road. Belongs to a trust now, I think. The papers said it was sold off years ago to settle debts. Nasty business, those debts. People still talk about them. There was one poor woman, name of Pike, if I recall, who lost her husband after that affair. Some said he'd borrowed from the elder Harcourt to pay for a surgery and could never recover the interest. Quite broke him." Miss Marple set her cup down very slowly. "Pike, you say?" "Yes, that's the name. Odd coincidence, isn't it?" "Not a coincidence, Edith. Merely history repeating itself." Her cousin looked puzzled. "But what could that have to do with this week's events?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she rose and went to the window, where the twilight deepened into violet. The pattern was clear now, the shape beneath all the stories and half-truths. It wasn't about love or guilt or even revenge. It was about the inheritance of ruin, the passing down of debt from father to son, until all that remained was poison. "Edith," she said softly, "I think I must pay a brief visit before supper. There's one more thing I need to be quite certain of." Before her cousin could protest, she had taken her shawl and stepped out once more into the cooling evening. The lane was nearly empty now. The last cart had gone, and the church bell struck 7 in the distance. She turned toward the mill road where the trees leaned close and the light faded quickly. The small cottage she sought stood apart from the others, an old place with sagging shutters and ivy climbing the walls. As she approached, she saw that the front door was ajar. A faint smell of dust and candle wax drifted out. Miss Marple hesitated only a moment, then pushed gently inside. The room was dim, the last rays of dusk filtering through warped glass. On the table by the window lay an opened envelope, the Kingsbridge postmark still fresh. Inside was a folded letter written in a firm, unfamiliar hand. She adjusted her spectacles and read, "To whomever finds this. The debt was never mine alone. My father borrowed, but it was Harcourt's father who demanded the pound of flesh. My life was merely the final payment. Tell her it is finished now." The signature at the bottom made her draw in a quiet breath. Edward Pike. Miss Marple stood for a long moment, the letter trembling slightly in her hand. Edward Pike, Mr. Raymond Pike's father. So the story had indeed begun a generation earlier. And this house, she realized, must have been his. Perhaps Raymond had returned here after the war, seeking the truth, carrying the bitterness of his father's ruin like an heirloom. The irony was bitter indeed, the son of a debtor poisoned by the heir of a usurer, each believing the other the villain, when in truth both were victims of an old cruelty neither had committed. Footsteps sounded faintly behind her, and she turned to see Inspector Wells in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I thought I might find you here," he said. "Mr. Cribb told me you'd gone wandering again." She smiled faintly. "It seems I cannot help myself, Inspector. But look, this letter may interest you." He read it in silence, then folded it carefully. "So it was always about money. Old sins, old names, old debts." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "And the tragedy is that none of them truly knew they were reenacting the same cruelty. They simply played the parts written for them years ago." Wells looked around the quiet room, the fading light casting long shadows across the table. "I suppose that's the final piece, then." "Perhaps," she said softly, "though I've never believed in final pieces. Life doesn't end neatly, Inspector. It only pauses." He regarded her for a moment, then nodded. "You're a remarkable woman, Miss Marple." She gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. "No, merely an old one, and old women see the world differently. We've lived long enough to know that wickedness seldom begins with wicked intent." They left the cottage together, closing the door behind them. The evening air was cool and still, the stars just beginning to appear above the trees. As they walked back toward the village, the inn's faint lantern lights came into view once more, glowing softly against the dusk. Miss Marple paused, looking back at the darkened cottage one last time. "Debts paid," she murmured, "but never truly settled." Then she turned toward the warmth of the lamps ahead, her small figure moving through the growing night, steady, certain, and quietly burdened by the knowledge that peace in Little Densworth, as in life, was only ever temporary. Morning broke soft and pale over Little Densworth, mist curling once again along the hedgerows as if reluctant to leave. The Candlelit Inn, so full of whispers and dread the night before, now stood still in the forgiving light of day. Inside, the fire was lit once more, and Inspector Wells sat at the old oak table, his report nearly complete. Across from him, Miss Marple poured tea with unhurried grace, her movements quiet and assured, as though the world had finally returned to its proper rhythm. "The coroner will be satisfied," Wells said, leaning back with a weary sigh. "2 deaths tied to the same poison, the same history. Both will be marked as tragedies of circumstance. The village can rest now." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Villages never truly rest, Inspector. They only wait until someone stirs the past again." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "You think there's more to it?" "There's always more." she said softly. But not in a way that changes what we already know, only in the way one finishes a tapestry, adding the final threads that make the whole pattern visible. Wells gestured for her to continue. She folded her hands neatly on the table, her eyes thoughtful. You see, the poison itself was never meant for Colonel Harcourt, or Mr. Pike for that matter. It was meant for the woman. The inspector's eyes widened. For Mrs. Harcourt? Miss Marple nodded gently. Or rather, for Miss Lydia Havisham, as her true name was before she took on the false one. She was the one who tied the final knot in this tragedy, but she wasn't the first target. Harcourt intended to take his own life, yes, but not before ensuring hers would follow. He left the tainted glass where she would find it, believing she'd drink it after him. You recall she said he begged her to destroy the letters for her protection. That was no plea, it was instruction, his final act of control. Wells stared at her, stunned. But she didn't drink it. Pike did. Quite so, Miss Marple said. He entered that room at the wrong moment. Perhaps he saw her crying beside the bed, perhaps he took the glass to calm her nerves, or perhaps he simply thought it water. By the time she realized what had happened, it was too late, and Harcourt, his pride wounded even in death, became what he'd always been, the architect of ruin. Wells exhaled slowly, a kind of reluctant admiration in his voice, and she carried the blame silently. Yes, Miss Marple said, because she thought it just. That is why she forged the letter, to protect him even after death, to make it seem noble. She thought love was redemption, when it was merely another kind of bondage. For a while, neither spoke. The fire cracked softly, its warmth filling the room. Outside, the village stirred to life. Carts rolling, doors opening, voices calling to one another as though the night's shadows had never been. At last, Wells rose and placed his notebook on the table. I'll file it your way, he said. It won't bring them back, but it'll make sense of the senseless. Miss Marple smiled gently. That's all we can do in this world, Inspector, make sense of what refuses to be neat. He hesitated at the door, looking back at her. I must say, Miss Marple, you have a most inconvenient talent for turning tragedy into philosophy. She gave a small laugh. Only because I've seen that the two are rarely apart. Most wickedness begins with a good intention, only left unattended too long. When he had gone, she sat for a while longer, watching the light play on the window pane. The inn was quiet now, its ghosts at last content to whisper only among themselves. On the table beside her lay the last remaining letter, Harcourt's handwriting, firm and proud even in deceit. She read the final line once more, then folded it carefully and slipped it into her bag. Forgive me, Lydia. The debt ends with me. Miss Marple rose, taking her shawl from the chair. Yes, she murmured to the empty room. It ends with you, but she paid it all the same. Outside, the morning light grew stronger, catching the wet cobbles and scattering them with faint reflections. As she walked down the lane, she passed the churchyard, where two fresh graves had been dug side by side. There were no mourners yet, only the quiet of earth ready to take what remained. She paused, her gaze steady, then inclined her head in the smallest of gestures, one part pity, one part forgiveness. Further along the lane, children were laughing near the green, their voices clear and bright. The sound carried on the breeze, dissolving the last of the gloom. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Life, as it always did, was already moving on. By the time she reached Edith's gate, the smell of baking drifted out through the open window, and the world felt safe again, at least for a little while. Edith met her at the door, flustered but cheerful. There you are, Jane. I was about to send for you. You must tell me everything. Was it dreadful? Oh, but you've that look again. What is it you always say? Miss Marple removed her gloves, her expression serene. That people are very much the same, dear. Whether they're in drawing rooms or inns, they all make the same mistakes, only dressed in different manners. Edith laughed, pouring tea, and the clock struck 10, lightly, almost merrily. Outside, the sky was clearing and a ray of sunlight slipped across the table between them. Miss Marple lifted her cup, her eyes bright and clear, though her voice was soft. "You see, Edith, even in the quietest of places, the past has its own way of keeping accounts, but every so often, if one listens carefully enough, it allows you to close the ledger." And with that, she sipped her tea, her gaze drifting toward the open window and the peaceful village beyond. The Candlelit Inn would keep its silence now, its debts finally settled, its ghosts at rest. And Miss Marple, calm and composed, allowed herself the smallest of sighs, half contentment, half melancholy, as the light deepened and the morning went on. The end.